November 9, 1944, somewhere outside Lubbock, Texas. A sky the color of hammered pewter hung low over the plains, the kind of sky that whispered of snow without ever delivering. Wind howled across the flatlands like a ghost train, dry and cold and relentless, kicking up red dust that clung to barbed wire and cracked boots alike. Then came the jolt. The truck lurched, axles groaning, chains clanking against its wooden walls. The German soldiers inside, 23 of them packed elbow to elbow, heads low, flinched as the vehicle crested a shallow rise and slammed back down onto hard-packed earth. No one spoke. They hadn't for hours. For most of them, the last thing they'd seen of Europe was the belly of an American Liberty ship. Days of steaming west across an ocean that never seemed to end, then a slow, meandering journey by rail deeper and deeper into a country so vast and alien it didn't seem real. Now this. A faint smell reached them, sweet and rich like burnt sugar and old iron. Some thought it was coal. Others, smoke from a far-off barn fire. But when the trucks rolled to a stop and the soldiers were ordered down at rifle point, they saw the truth. It wasn't fire they smelled, it was cattle. Hundreds of them, maybe more, spread out across the plains like a moving carpet of flesh and horns. A dozen cowboys on horseback, actual cowboys, cut through the herd with ropes and long shadows, their wide-brimmed hats turned down against the wind, boots tucked into stirrups, pistols at their hips not for show, but for snakes, coyotes, and maybe, if necessary, them. A barbed wire fence stretched for miles in either direction. Beyond it, 2 weather-beaten barns and a main house sat squat and stubborn against the horizon, like they'd been there since the Comanches still ruled these parts. Sergeant Dieter Markel, who had fought in the North African deserts and bled in Sicily before being captured in Normandy, blinked against the dust and muttered, "Wo zum Teufel sind wir? Where the hell are we?" The answer came not from a translator, but from a sign nailed crookedly to a fence post, swaying in the wind. Double Spur Ranch, keep gates closed, watch for rattlesnakes. This wasn't a military installation. This was no prison in the traditional sense. There were no guard towers, no searchlights, only ranch hands, rope, cattle, and land, endless, unforgiving land. They weren't going to be locked up. They were going to be worked. The initial disorientation didn't wear off. That first night, the Germans were marched into a clapboard bunkhouse that reeked of linseed oil, sweat, and old hay. Tin cots lined the walls. A cast-iron stove burned low in the center, glowing orange and quiet. Dinner wasn't prison rations but plates of beans, cornbread, and something called chuck steak, all served under the eyes of a one-armed cook named Earl, who never smiled and never stopped chewing tobacco. When one of the younger soldiers, a boy from Hamburg named Vogel, whispered that this must be some kind of trick, that the Americans were fattening them up before interrogation, another soldier replied bitterly, "Then let them. I'd rather die full." They weren't interrogated. Instead, at dawn, they were handed work gloves. The man who met them outside the bunkhouse was named Luther McGraw. 60, maybe 70, built like a fence post and mean-looking even when silent. He didn't wear a uniform. He wore a long duster, a Colt revolver low on his hip, and a starched white shirt despite the dust. He didn't say much, just pointed to the corral and said one word, "Post holes." Markel stepped forward. "We are soldiers, not farmhands." Luther spat chew near Markel's boots and muttered, "Out here you're neither. You're diggers." By noon, the wind had shifted, carrying the scent of manure and mesquite. The sun turned harsh and flat, baking their skin even as the air stayed cold. They had no tools but shovels and augers. They were expected to learn fencing, branding, digging, and wrangling without instruction. They were not guarded by soldiers. They were guarded by geography. The ranch spanned over 20,000 acres. No fences in sight for some parts. The nearest town, Littlefield, was nearly 40 miles east. Escape wasn't just unlikely, it was suicidal. So they worked. One man collapsed from heat. Another nearly stepped on a rattlesnake. When a fight broke out between two Germans over a stolen biscuit, one of the cowboys simply fired his rifle into the air, not as a warning, just as punctuation. The rifle was a Winchester .30-30, old but clean. That sound, crackling like thunder, was enough to restore order. After a week, their hands were blistered and their pride eroded. But something else began to happen. They watched the Americans. One cowboy named Levi, no older than 20, rode bareback with a lasso like it was part of his arm. He could rope a steer at full gallop. Another, called Big Red, could shoot a tin can off a fence post from horseback at 100 yards. They weren't soldiers, but they weren't soft either. During one branding session, a steer got loose. It barreled straight at the Germans. Every man flinched, except Vogel, the same boy who had feared interrogation. He grabbed a spade and swung it blindly, hitting the beast across the snout. It veered off. Big Red let out a whoop. Maybe y'all ain't useless after all. They were starting to change. One night, two of the Germans snuck out. They thought they could make it east toward the town. Maybe steal a car. Maybe find a train. They made it 10 miles before collapsing from dehydration. Luther McGraw found them the next morning. He didn't punish them. He gave them water, then handed them shovels. You still owe me 20 holes. 3 weeks in, the transformation was undeniable. The POWs had learned to saddle horses, move herds, fix fences, and even smoke hand-rolled cigarettes like the Americans. They had developed a grudging respect for the Cowboys, and maybe, even more surprising, the Cowboys began to respect them back. One evening during a storm, lightning shattered an old cottonwood and set a hay shed ablaze. The fire spread fast, fueled by wind and dry grass. Without orders, without hesitation, the Germans formed a bucket line. Earl the cook later said, "They moved faster than my boys." But still, there was one thing the Germans couldn't make sense of. Why? Why weren't they in cages? Why weren't they starved, punished, humiliated? Sergeant Markle finally asked Luther McGraw one night while helping repair a fence line. "You do not hate us?" Luther looked out over the plains at the stars stretching endlessly above the land and said flatly, "Hate takes time. I've got cows to feed." Then he walked off, leaving Markle standing there, the wind tugging at his sleeves and the cold night full of more questions than answers. The American West hadn't conquered them by force. It had seduced them with its silence, with its land, with its strange, unsentimental freedom. And the Germans, who once marched across Europe under steel helmets and black banners, were now, absurdly, unironically, beginning to feel like cowboys. The ranch had a rhythm, sunrise to sunset, chores and dirt, coffee brewed black as axle grease, and a silence that fell heavy after dark. After nearly a month, the Germans had learned the timing of it. The wind always picked up around noon, dry and sharp as a whip. The coyotes started calling just after sundown. The cattle moved slowest in the early hours before the heat could wake the flies. And if you were lucky, Levi would hum some kind of bluegrass tune from his saddle while chewing on a straw, like some relic out of a movie none of them had ever seen. But the longer they stayed, the more surreal it all became. Take their mail, for instance. Letters were allowed, though slow. One afternoon, a stack of envelopes arrived at the bunkhouse. The American interpreter, Private Higgins, a skinny 20-year-old from Oklahoma with a stutter and a nervous smile, read off the names. Klaus Eugen Friedrich. Each man who stepped forward took his letter with a sort of reverence, unfolding those creased pages like they were holding onto fragments of another life. Markle didn't get one. Neither did Vogel. But a corporal named Erich Schneider did, and something about that letter broke him. He didn't cry. Germans didn't do that. But he sat on the bunk for a long time afterward, staring at the dirt floor like it might give him an answer. Finally, when Markel pressed him, Schneider handed him the letter. "Your daughter starts school next spring," it read. "She asks if you will be home to see her write her first word." Markel folded it carefully and said nothing. There was nothing to say. Winter came late to West Texas, but when it did, it arrived like a thief, fast, bitter, and without apology. The wind stopped playing games and began to cut through their jackets like knives. Even the Cowboys complained, and they were men whose hands had calluses deeper than most people's regrets. But the work didn't stop. If anything, it grew harder. A delivery truck showed up just before Christmas, unloading sacks of feed, a busted radio, and a few crates labeled U.S. Army surplus. Inside were wool coats, gloves, boots, enough to keep the Germans from freezing, but nothing new. All of it was worn, patched, and smelled like must and mothballs. Still, it was more than any of them expected. As they sorted through the clothes, Vogel held up a coat with a name stitched into the collar. McIntyre. "Probably some American killed in France," someone muttered. "No," said Higgins, the interpreter who had walked in unnoticed. "That was my uncle, died in Tunisia. The army sent his gear back." No one spoke after that. They just took the coats and put them on. It was Christmas Eve when everything shifted. The Germans had finished stacking hay bales when they were called to the main house. Not the bunkhouse, the main house, which until then had been off-limits. Markel entered first, wary, unsure. Inside, the long dining table had been cleared. Plates, tin cups, and a pot of something warm sat steaming in the center. Not just beans, not cornbread, real food. Roast pork, mashed potatoes, coffee with sugar. Luther McGraw sat at the head of the table, coat draped over a chair, sleeves rolled up. His Colt still hung at his hip, but his face was less granite tonight. Maybe it was the smell of cinnamon in the air. Maybe it was the firelight. "We ain't got no ornaments," he said, "but I reckon this'll do." The Germans hesitated. Then Schneider, the man with the letter from his daughter, stepped forward and took a seat. The others followed. Levi poured coffee. Big Red brought a fiddle and played some rough Appalachian tune none of them knew but all of them felt. And when it was all over, when the plates had been scraped clean and the wind outside howled like a dying animal, McGraw raised his cup and said something none of them ever expected. "To peace, even if it's temporary." Markel raised his. The others did too. Even Vogel. Especially Vogel. After that night, the line between prisoner and laborer began to blur. Not officially. Officially, they were still enemy soldiers, still POWs under Geneva protection, still watched, still subject to the whims of war. But in practice, they were cowboys now. They rode fence lines. They helped birth calves. They learned to sharpen knives, repair saddles, even shoot, yes, shoot rifles, not at enemies, at coyotes, at rustlers, at tin cans lined on a fence post in the dead of afternoon. Levi taught them the trick of spitting tobacco through a moving horse's ears without missing. No one succeeded, but everyone tried. Red taught them to skin rattlesnakes. McGraw didn't teach. He just watched, quietly, always with the same unreadable stare, like he was trying to decide if they were men or just memories in the making. Then came the day the sheriff arrived. January 6, 1945. Sheriff Boone, 6'3", silver hair, revolver big enough to shoot through a barn door. He came in a cloud of dust and authority, boots stomping like thunder across the porch. "Had a report," he said, "that some o' them Krauts been seen in town, near the feed store." Everyone went still. McGraw didn't blink. "You sure it was Higgins?" Boone grunted. "You lettin' 'em roam, Luther?" "I'm lettin' 'em work. They got rules. They ain't broke 'em. Yet." Markel stood nearby, translating in pieces. Most of the men didn't understand, but they could feel the tension. Boone's eyes swept over them like searchlights, landing on Vogel, who was holding a horseshoe like it was something sacred. "You speak English, boy?" Vogel nodded slowly. "Yes, a little." "You goin' anywhere without permission?" "No, sir." Boone stared a second longer, then spit in the dust. "If one of 'em runs, I shoot first. No questions." McGraw gave the faintest nod. "So will I." Boone left. And for the first time, the Germans saw Luther McGraw not as a jailer or a cowboy, but as something else entirely. One of them. Caught between two worlds, neither friend nor enemy, just a man trying to survive a war he didn't ask for. A week later, a telegram arrived. The war in Europe was entering its final phase. The Ardennes had been bloodied, the German lines pushed back. Rumors swirled about Berlin, about Hitler, about collapses and suicides. Some of the POWs began to whisper. What if it ends? What happens to us? Do we go home? Do we stay? Do we even belong anywhere now? Markel, for his part, stopped asking questions. He just worked. He fixed saddles, milked cows, hauled feed, listened to the wind at night, and tried to remember what snow sounded like on Bavarian rooftops. But something inside him was shifting. One night, sitting outside the bunkhouse, wrapped in a U.S. Army surplus blanket, he looked up and realized he no longer jumped when the coyotes howled. That spring, a heifer went into labor early. It was bad. Rain was coming. The cow was panicking, thrashing. Levi couldn't hold her steady, and Big Red was off with another crew. McGraw barked orders. Hold her down. Markel didn't hesitate. He grabbed the rope and threw his weight across the cow's shoulders. Blood smeared the ground. Mud soaked through his knees. Get in there, McGraw shouted. And Vogel did. The boy from Hamburg, the one who once feared being interrogated. He reached in, bare arms shaking, and helped pull a slick, trembling calf into the storm. It breathed. It stood. They all stared in silence. And then McGraw laughed. A low, rasping sound like rusted iron. Hell, he muttered, you boys are real cowhands now. That night, for the first time, a German soldier rang the dinner bell. Not because he had to. Because he wanted to. And as the others filed in, dirty, tired, cold, they smiled. Not big smiles, just small ones. The kind you get when something is broken and begins slowly to heal. The war wasn't over. Not yet. But out there in the open plains of Texas, a group of enemy soldiers had somehow found a piece of peace. Spring changed the land like a second skin peeling off. The brittle brown grass gave way to stubborn green shoots. The wind turned warmer, thicker with pollen, and the smell of mesquite blossoms began to replace that of rawhide and manure. Somewhere beyond the hills, bluebonnets exploded across old cattle trails, and the dust, for once, stayed low. The Germans had been at the ranch for over 5 months. By now, routines had hardened into instinct. Wake at 4:45, coffee by 5, out to the pens by 5:30, muck stalls, rotate herds, fix fences, sharpen blades, work until your knuckles split or the sun forced you into shade. Some had even earned nicknames. Markel the sergeant was now hardtack, named after the jaw-breaking army ration and the way he refused to complain, no matter how long the workday dragged. Vogel, the youngest, had become Sparrow for how he sang under his breath during fence runs. One soldier named Weber, who had once been a Panzer mechanic, was now just Grease, a man who could fix anything with baling wire and spit. But they were still Germans, still POWs. They never forgot that. They were reminded of it one Sunday morning when Levi rode in from the edge of the property, his face drawn, eyes darker than usual. Train went through, he said. Empty flatbeds headed east. McGraw nodded but didn't say anything. The Germans stared at one another, the meaning clear. Empty cars headed east meant full ones coming west. More prisoners. More of them. More Germans. Maybe even someone they knew. 2 days later, the trucks arrived. 6 of them, each flanked by MPs in full kit, bayonets fixed and gloves white with starch. This was different from when they had arrived, tighter, harsher. A young lieutenant barked orders like he was still storming Omaha Beach. The new POWs, around 30, looked rough, hollow eyes, bandaged arms. Some limped. A few had Red Cross tags still tied to their sleeves. They had come straight from the bulge. From hell. When the Germans from the double spur stepped forward to help unload the gear, the MPs raised rifles. "They're cleared," McGraw said without emotion. "They work here." The lieutenant glared. "They're still Krauts." McGraw didn't blink. "And you're still a guest on my land." The rifles lowered. Among the new prisoners was a man named Hans Rupp, Oberfeldwebel, decorated, stern, with an iron cross around his neck and eyes that cut like razors. He didn't speak much at first, just watched, judged, measured. He noticed everything. He noticed how Markel spoke to the Americans without flinching, how Vogel whittled wood while humming American songs, how the men carried themselves, not like prisoners but like ranch hands. "You've gone soft," he said on the second day while working fence line. "All of you, look at you, digging holes like peasants, smiling at them." Markel leaned on his shovel and met the man's gaze. "What would you rather do? Starve in a camp? Dig ditches in Arkansas mud?" "I'd rather die German," Rupp growled. "You are dying German," Markel said, "only slower and with a full stomach." The tension simmered for days. The newcomers refused to eat with the old crew, refused to work the same shifts, refused to speak English even when Higgins, the interpreter, offered help. It wasn't just nationalism, it was grief. These men had lost friends, limbs, faith. They hadn't been eased into captivity. They'd been captured in chaos. On the 5th night, it boiled over. A brawl erupted near the hay barn. Rupp threw the first punch. Markel didn't back down. The 2 men went at it with fists and fury while the others circled, too stunned to intervene. Rupp was bigger, but Markel was meaner. When it was over, both men were bleeding, breathless, and kneeling in the dirt. That's when McGraw showed up. He didn't yell. He didn't pull a weapon. He walked up between the 2 men and said, "If either of you break my barn again, I'll make you rebuild it with your teeth." Then he handed them each a hammer. "New rule," he added, "fight you build." By nightfall, they'd rebuilt 2 stalls together, side by side without a word. Days turned to weeks, and slowly the new men adjusted. Not all of them. One tried to escape, ran 12 miles before collapsing near a dry riverbed. He was found by Levi and brought back slung over a saddle, unconscious, sunburned so badly his skin peeled for days. He never tried again. But most began to relent. They began to understand that this place, this strange, sun-scorched, dust-covered ranch, was not a punishment. It was a test, a kind of purgatory between war and whatever came next. And in purgatory there was work. There was order. There was dignity. One of the new Germans, a man named Klaus, turned out to be a trained veterinarian. When one of the prize bulls went lame, he stepped forward. The Americans hesitated. McGraw watched. Klaus asked for iodine, gauze, a scalpel. He got them. The bull lived. After that, Klaus was never called prisoner again. He was just Doc. It was late April when the radio crackled with news from Europe. Berlin surrounded. SS units retreating or surrendering en masse. And finally, on May 7th, the words came through the static like a blade through fog. Germany has surrendered, unconditionally. The bunkhouse fell silent. No one cheered. No one wept. They just sat. Men who had once marched under banners now sat in borrowed boots, breathing Texas air, wondering what it meant. "Are we free?" Vogel asked, voice shaking. Higgins didn't answer. Because no one knew. Weeks passed, nothing changed. They still worked. Still ate. Still rode. But a question hung in the air now, thick, invisible, always present. What now? McGraw never addressed it. He just handed out tools, muttered about feed deliveries, and kept the men busy. One day, while working the well pump, Rupp approached Markle. "You think they'll send us back?" "I don't know. I have nothing to return to." Markle nodded. "I'm not sure I want to." That made Markle pause. He looked at the open land, the horses grazing near the cottonwoods, the sun sinking behind the hills like a promise that never broke. And for the first time in months, he said the thing aloud that had haunted him. "Neither do I." Then came the letter. A single envelope, addressed to McGraw, official U.S. Army seal, inside orders. POWs to be processed, sorted, returned. Not all at once, but soon. Higgins read it aloud, voice flat. Some would go back to camps. Some would ship out. The ranch was to be cleared of POW labor within 90 days. The room fell into a silence thicker than any storm. "Then this is it," said Klaus. "End of the line." But it was. Because McGraw stood, took off his hat, and said quietly, "No." The next morning, he rode into town. When he came back, he brought papers. Contracts. Job offers. For after the war. Civilian. Legal. Conditional, of course, only if approved, only if they passed vetting. But it was a chance. A few men refused. They were going home to rebuild, to find what was left. But others. Markle signed. So did Vogel. So did Klaus, Grease, Sparrow, even Rupp. It wasn't that they loved America. It was that they'd seen what life could be without war. And they weren't ready to let that go. In the final days, they held a cookout. Not a celebration, a goodbye. Steaks on open flame, coffee black and strong, even a bottle of whiskey passed hand to hand, a gift from Levi's father. Laughter came easy. So did silence. At the end of it, McGraw stood and said the only thing he ever really needed to say. "You worked, you didn't complain, you became more than what you were." He raised a tin cup. To second chances. They raised theirs in return. And for one moment under that wide Texas sky, no one was German. No one was American. They were just men. Men who had survived. By early June 1945, the landscape was shifting again, not just in Europe, where the Allies were walking through the rubble of the Third Reich, but here, on the Double Spur Ranch, where the men no longer carried their burdens like they used to. It was in the way they stood taller. The way their voices no longer dropped to whispers when an American walked by. The way their laughter began to sound less like survival and more like belonging. The U.S. Army had started the process of transporting POWs out of non-essential labor sites. That meant ranches like McGraw's, no matter how efficient, would soon be cleared of their German workforce. But a loophole emerged. Under the War Manpower Commission's emergency labor classification, civilians, if vouched for, could be retained temporarily in agricultural districts critical to food supply. So McGraw did what no one expected. He vouched. One by one. He filled out papers, wrote letters, even traveled to Amarillo and sat across from a colonel who clearly hated paperwork more than war itself. "They're good men," McGraw told him. The colonel raised a skeptical brow. They were the enemy. Still are by uniform, but that uniform's buried under 6 months of dirt and sweat and cow dung. You want food this fall. You'll need hands that already know the land. The colonel sighed and signed. Of the original 23, 15 chose to stay. They became temporary civilian workers under the Agricultural Retention Program. Not prisoners, not soldiers, not exactly free but no longer under guard. The first morning they woke up with no MP on the porch, no locked gate at night, and no enforced roll call. They stood quietly in the bunkhouse, unsure of what to do. Vogel broke the spell by going outside, grabbing a spade, and heading to the new orchard plot that had been his project since March. Work was work, and that more than anything defined them now. Marco found himself changing in small, strange ways. He began taking his coffee with sugar. He started wearing his hat cocked just like Levi did, brim low to block the rising sun. He caught himself humming Johnny Cash songs he didn't understand the words to. And he didn't care. What startled him most was how normal it began to feel, how familiar. He knew where the nails were kept in the barn, which fence posts would rot by August, how much feed the bulls needed after a rainstorm. He knew the names of the horses, real names, not just numbers: Daisy, Buck, General Patton, even Goering, a lazy mule the Germans had named ironically because he never worked. He was still a German, still marked by the war. But here on this land, he was also something else. A man needed. A man trusted. A man with a place in the world again. The town of Littlefield didn't forget who they were, but over time the stares softened. Vogel began to go into town alone. At first it was just for supplies: rope, feed, ointment for hoof rot. Then one day he came back with a pocket knife he'd bought from a hardware store, his name carved into the handle by a store clerk who didn't ask him where he was from. He showed it off like a badge. That same week, Schneider, who had once cried over a letter from his daughter, sat on the porch of the general store playing checkers with a local farmer who had lost a son in the Pacific. Some full of ashes. One man learned his wife had remarried, another that his brother had died in a Soviet camp. Schneider's daughter had drawn a picture of a cow and signed it for Papa, who works on a farm in America. He tacked it above his bunk like it was a medal. But it was Vogel's letter that changed everything. It arrived mid-July, during a heat wave so bad even the horses were restless. He read it once, twice, then walked straight to McGraw, who was under a tractor fixing a bent axle. "My mother is alive," Vogel said. McGraw grunted. "She's alone." He said it not as a question, not as a plea. But McGraw saw the truth in the boy's eyes. A war had taken everything from him, and now he was being given the chance to go back. "I want to leave," Vogel said. McGraw climbed out from under the tractor and dusted off his hands. "You're not a prisoner," he said. "You want to go, you go." And that was it. No ceremony. No farewell. Just a handshake. A saddlebag of provisions. And a ride to the train station. They watched Vogel disappear down the dusty road, head held high, leaving behind the only peace he'd known since the war began. August 14th, 1945. The radio crackled like dry leaves. Japan has surrendered. The war was over. For real this time. In the years that followed, more men passed. Schneider died in 1962, buried next to his wife, an Oklahoma schoolteacher who had taught him how to write in English without stammering. Klaus moved north and became one of the first German-born veterinarians to be certified in Texas. Grease retired to Arizona and sent postcards with nothing but hand-drawn cartoons of cacti and longhorns wearing sunglasses. But Markel stayed. Every morning, same ritual. Coffee before sunrise. Rope looped through his belt. A minute of silence by the cottonwood. Then work. Always work. He didn't speak much about the war anymore. Only when pressed. Only when the questions came from someone who needed to know, not from curiosity, but from pain. A young ranch hand once asked him what it felt like, coming to America in chains. Markle looked at his hands, rough and scarred, and said, "It felt like punishment. Then it felt like labor. Then it felt like purpose." He paused. Same hands, different weight. By 1973, most of the original men were gone. Markle walked slower. His hair thinned. But he never left. They called him boss now. Even men half his age, born long after Hitler's voice stopped echoing on shortwave radios, still deferred to the quiet man with the hard stare and soft voice. His son, now grown, ran the business side of the ranch. His daughter taught at the school in Littlefield. At night, Markle sat on the porch with a battered guitar and played the same 3 chords over and over, songs he never finished, words he never sang. Because the land had already told the story. He was just the echo. In 1981, on a cold February morning, Markle died in his sleep. A simple passing. No drama. Just a man slipping out of a body that had carried too many miles. They buried him next to McGraw. 2 crosses, no dates, no ranks. Only names. Luther McGraw. Dieter Markle. And beneath them, carved into a shared stone. Built fences, fed cattle, buried the war. The ranch still stands. Still works. Still feeds. The bunkhouse is modern now, electric heating, a radio that doesn't crackle. But the fence posts, same ones, some with initials carved faintly into them, KM, FS, HV, names long gone but not forgotten. Every so often, a visitor drives down the dusty path. A historian. A grandchild. A curious stranger. They ask the foreman, now a third-generation rancher, about the war, about the Germans, about the myth. He always smiles, spits in the dirt, and says the same thing. They weren't prisoners, they were cowboys. Then he goes back to work. Because out there, under that endless Texas sky, that's what keeps memory alive. Not stories. Not monuments. But labor. Sweat. Grit. And the freedom to start again.